The diner sat like a tired soldier on the edge of Route 9, its neon sign flickering pink and blue against the bruised twilight of a July evening in 1973. The air inside was thick with the smell of frying meat, cigarette smoke, and the chemical sweetness of cherry pie cooling under glass domes. A Wurlitzer jukebox in the corner played Patsy Cline, her voice crackling through the static of worn speakers, singing about falling to pieces. In the corner booth, beneath a mounted bass that had been varnished so many times its scales looked like amber, sat a woman whose hunger had become a physical presence. Her name was Caroline Mercer, though nobody in the diner knew it. She was 34, but looked older in the harsh fluorescent light, her cheekbones too prominent beneath skin that had the translucent quality of someone who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Her hands were folded on the Formica tabletop, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone white. She stared at those hands because looking at the plate across from her had become unbearable. The plate belonged to her husband. Douglas Mercer was a man who wore his success like cologne, too much of it, applied with the assumption that everyone wanted to smell it. His suit was charcoal gray with thin pinstripes, tailored in Chicago, and his tie was loosened just enough to suggest a man comfortable with his dominion over smaller things. His hair was slicked back with Brylcreem, catching the light in a way that made it look wet, predatory. On his wrist, a Rolex Submariner caught the diner's neon and threw it back in fractured rainbows. Before him sat a porterhouse steak, thick as a Bible, swimming in its own juices. A mountain of French fries, golden and glistening with salt. A wedge of iceberg lettuce drowning in Thousand Island dressing. A buttered roll torn open, steam still rising from its soft white interior. The plate was a taunt, a sermon delivered in meat and starch. Caroline had a glass of water. Ice cubes floated in it like tiny glaciers, melting slowly. "You're not even going to ask?" Douglas said, cutting into the steak with theatrical precision. The knife was serrated, and it made a sound against the ceramic that set Caroline's teeth on edge. Pink juice ran across the plate. He speared a piece of meat the size of a cigarette pack and held it up, examining it in the light as though appraising a gemstone. "No, nothing," she said nothing. Her stomach made a sound like tearing fabric. "That's what I thought," he said, and put the meat in his mouth. He chewed slowly, eyes on her, watching for the moment her resolve would crack. This was the game. This was always the game. She stared at those hands because looking at the plate across from her had become unbearable. The plate belonged to her husband. In the Lincoln Continental parked outside, a 1972 Mark IV in diamond blue, with a white vinyl roof and wire wheels that cost more than most men made in 6 months, there was a cooler in the trunk. In that cooler were 3 club sandwiches from the country club, wrapped in wax paper. Caroline had made them that morning before they left for his mother's funeral in Missouri. She had been permitted to make them. She had not been permitted to eat them. "You know what the doctor said," Douglas continued, dragging a fry through ketchup with the deliberation of a man performing surgery. "You need to lose weight. What are you now, 140, 150? He popped the fry into his mouth. "It's embarrassing, Caroline. My colleagues, their wives, they take care of themselves. You used to take care of yourself." Caroline was 5'6" and weighed 118 pounds. Her dress, a floral print she'd sewn herself from a Simplicity pattern, hung on her frame like laundry on a line. The Dr. Douglas referred to was not a doctor, but a pharmacist in Des Moines who sold him amphetamines in brown bottles with typeprint labels. Caroline had stopped taking them after she collapsed in the yard while hanging sheets. That had been in May. Douglas had not noticed the bruise on her hip where she'd hit the ground, or if he had, he'd said nothing. 3 booths away, a man in a khaki uniform watched this theater of cruelty with the patience of someone who had seen worse and the resolve of someone who would not permit worse to continue. Sheriff John Miller was 58 years old and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the booths in the diner. Hard, weathered, shaped by years of exposure to the elements. He'd been eating meatloaf and mashed potatoes when the Mercers walked in, and he'd noted them the way a good lawman notes everything. The woman's hollow eyes, the man's hand on her elbow, not guiding but gripping. The way she'd slid into the booth and immediately folded into herself, making her body as small as possible. the way the man had ordered without asking her what she wanted. Miller had served in Korea. He'd been at Chosin Reservoir when the Chinese came down from the mountains in human waves, when men froze to death in their sleeping bags and ammunition shattered in the cold like glass. He'd learned things there about human nature, about what men were capable of when they believed no one was watching. He'd also learned that sometimes the most important thing a man could do was watch, and then act. He picked up his coffee, thick diner coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Eisenhower administration, and took a sip, never taking his eyes off Douglas Mercer. The waitress, a woman named Dottie who'd been working at the diner since it opened in 1952, came by with the coffee pot. She was 63, with hair the color of nicotine stains and the kind of weariness that comes from standing on linoleum for 4 decades. She'd seen the same thing Miller was seeing. In her experience, men like Douglas Mercer were a particular breed of coward, the kind who needed an audience for their cruelty but would fold like a card table if confronted by anyone who could fight back. "More coffee, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice pitched low. "Please," Miller said, then quieter, "how long they been here?" 20 minutes, he ordered the porterhouse. She got water. When I asked if she wanted anything, he said she was on a diet. Dottie's mouth was a thin line. I wanted to pour this coffee over his head. "Don't," Miller said. "I'll handle it." Dottie filled his cup and moved on, her orthopedic shoes squeaking on the floor. At the Mercer's booth, Douglas had moved on to the loaded baked potato. He'd cut it open, and steam rose from the white flesh inside like a soul escaping a body. He dumped sour cream and bacon bits onto it with the casualness of someone who had never once considered scarcity. Caroline watched the steam, watched it dissipate into the cigarette smoke and the cooling air from the overhead fan, and felt something in her chest tighten like a fist. "Remember when we went to that steakhouse in Omaha?" Douglas said, forking a massive bite of potato into his mouth. "For our anniversary, you ate so much you got sick in the car. That was when I started to worry about you, about your discipline." That had been 8 years ago. Caroline had eaten a salad and half a piece of bread. She'd gotten sick because Douglas had spent the dinner telling her, in exquisite detail, about his secretary's legs, about the way she leaned over his desk when she brought him files, about the perfume she wore that smelled like gardenias. She'd gotten sick because her body had finally rebelled against the accumulation of small violences, the death by 1,000 cuts that was her marriage. She said nothing. Douglas smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he'd won. In the Lincoln Continental parked outside, a 1972 Mark IV in diamond blue, with a white vinyl roof and wire wheels that cost more than most men made in 6 months, there was a cooler in the trunk. In that cooler were 3 club sandwiches from the country club, wrapped in wax paper. Sheriff Miller stood up. He was 6'2" and had the build of someone who'd done hard labor before the war and harder labor after it. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished to a mirror shine. Caroline had made them that morning before they left for his mother's funeral in Missouri. She had been permitted to make them. She had not been permitted to eat them. On his hip, a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver sat in a leather holster that was older than most of the cars in the parking lot. He walked with the kind of deliberate slowness that made people pay attention, each boot strike on the linoleum a proclamation. "You know what the doctor said," Douglas continued, dragging a fry through ketchup with the deliberation of a man performing surgery. "You need to lose weight. What are you now, 140, 150? He popped the fry into his mouth. When he reached the Mercer's booth, he stood there for a moment, looking down at Douglas with the expression of a man examining something distasteful he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. Douglas looked up. The smile was still on his face, but it had become uncertain around the edges. "Can I help you with something, officer?" "Sheriff," Miller corrected. His voice was low, gravelly, the product of too many unfiltered cigarettes and too many years giving orders that needed to be followed. "Sheriff John Miller. I'm the law in this county." "Okay," Douglas said, drawing the word out, trying to reclaim the initiative. "Well, Sheriff, my wife and I are just having dinner. Is there a problem?" Miller looked at Caroline. She was staring at the table, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to disappear into the vinyl seat. He looked back at Douglas. "Step outside with me," Miller said. It was not a request. Douglas's face went through a series of calculations, indignation, confusion, a flicker of genuine fear before his arrogance reasserted itself. "Excuse me, I'm in the middle of a meal. I don't know what you think you saw, but—" "Outside," Miller repeated. "Now." The diner had gone quiet. Patsy Cline was still singing, but the clatter of silverware had stopped, the murmur of conversation had died. Everyone was watching. Dottie stood by the kitchen window, coffee pot in hand, her expression somewhere between satisfaction and concern. Douglas looked around, realized he had an audience, and made his choice. He slid out of the booth, tugging his suit jacket straight. "Fine, but I don't appreciate being harassed while I'm trying to enjoy a meal with my wife." Miller gestured toward the door with one hand. The other rested on his belt, inches from his revolver. Not threatening, exactly, just present. They walked outside into the parking lot, where the air was cooler and smelled of asphalt and distant rain. Douglas had not noticed the bruise on her hip where she'd hit the ground, or if he had, he'd said nothing. The sun had set completely now, and the only light came from the diner's neon sign and the single street lamp at the edge of the lot. Miller stopped next to the Lincoln Continental and turned to face Douglas. "Let me tell you something," Miller said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I've been doing this job for 30 years. I've seen all kinds of men, and I know your kind." Douglas tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. "My kind? What's that supposed to mean? Listen, I don't know what you think you saw in there, but my wife and I—" "Your wife," Miller interrupted, "weighs about as much as a strong wind could carry away. And you're sitting there eating a feast while she drinks water. You're telling her she needs to lose weight when she looks like she hasn't had a proper meal in months." "That's none of your business," Douglas said, and now there was heat in his voice, the indignation of a man who believed his castle was being stormed. "What happens between a man and his wife is private. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Miller said. "This is my county, and in my county I don't let men torture their wives in public diners." He stepped closer, and Douglas stepped back, his shoulders hitting the Continental's door. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I haven't seen it before?" "I'm not doing anything," Douglas said, but his voice had gone thin. "She's on a diet, doctor's orders, I'm helping her." "By starving her? By humiliating her?" Miller's jaw tightened. "You want to know what I think? I think you're a coward. I think you get off on making her feel small because it's the only way you can feel big." Douglas's face flushed red. "You can't talk to me like that. I'll report you. I'll call your superior. I'll have your badge." Miller smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Go ahead. Call the county commissioner. His name's Bill Patterson. We served together in Korea. He'll tell you the same thing I'm about to tell you." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're going to get in that fancy car of yours. You're going to drive out of my county. And you're not going to come back tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either. Give your wife some space to think." "You can't make me leave," Douglas said, but there was no conviction in it. "She's my wife. That's my legal right." "Legal right?" Miller repeated, tasting the words like they were sour. "You know what else is legal? Me arresting you for public disturbance, disorderly conduct. I could say you were drunk. I could say you threatened me. Your word against mine, and I'm the sheriff." He let that sink in. "Or you could just drive away. Come back tomorrow, act like a human being. But tonight, you're leaving, and she's staying here where I can keep an eye on things." Douglas opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted around the parking lot as if looking for witnesses, for someone who might take his side. There was no one, just the sheriff and the neon light and the weight of a situation he couldn't control. "This isn't over," Douglas finally said. "You haven't heard the last of this." "Maybe not," Miller said, "but for tonight it is. Now get in the car." Douglas fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly. He got into the Continental, started the engine, and backed out of the parking space with more speed than was necessary. The tires squealed. He drove off toward the highway, the taillights disappearing into the darkness. Miller stood there for a moment, watching until the car was completely out of sight. Then he walked back into the diner. The bell above the door chimed. Every head turned to look at him. The way she'd slid into the booth and immediately folded into herself, making her body as small as possible. The way the man had ordered without asking her what she wanted. Caroline was still in the booth, still staring at her hands. Miller walked over and slid into the seat across from her, the seat Douglas had occupied. The porterhouse was still there, half-eaten, congealing in its own fat. "Ma'am," Miller said gently, "your husband's gone. He won't be back tonight. You're safe." Caroline looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them, confusion, maybe, or disbelief. "Why did you do that?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Miller said. "And because nobody should have to sit in a diner and watch someone they love hurt them." Dottie appeared beside the booth, coffee pot in one hand, menu in the other. "Honey," she said to Caroline, her voice soft, "what can I get you, on the house?" Caroline stared at the menu like it was written in a foreign language. I'm not supposed to." "You're supposed to eat," Miller said firmly. "You're a grown woman. You can order whatever you want." Caroline's hands were trembling. She looked at the menu, then at Dottie, then back at Miller. "The chicken fried steak," she whispered, "with mashed potatoes and gravy, and green beans, and a Coke." Dottie smiled. "Coming right up, sweetheart." She squeezed Caroline's shoulder and disappeared into the kitchen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The jukebox had moved on to Hank Williams. Outside, a truck rumbled past on Route 9, its headlights sweeping across the windows. "What happens now?" Caroline asked. Her voice was small, frightened. "Now you eat," Miller said, "and then we'll figure out the rest. Do you have family, friends, somewhere you can go?" Caroline shook her head. "My parents are dead. Douglas, he didn't like me talking to people, said they were a bad influence, said they were trying to turn me against him." Miller nodded. He'd heard this before, too. Isolation was part of the playbook. "There's a church house on Maple Street. Woman named Martha runs it. She helps people who need a place to stay. Clean bed, no questions asked. I can take you there after you eat." "And then what?" Caroline's eyes were filling with tears now. "He'll come back. He'll find me. He always finds me." "Then I'll deal with him again," Miller said. "As many times as it takes. But Caroline, can I call you Caroline?" She nodded. "Caroline, you need to understand something. What he's doing to you, starving you, controlling you, making you feel worthless, that's not love. That's not marriage, that's abuse, and you don't have to live with it." "But I don't have any money," she said. "No job, I haven't worked since we got married. Everything is in his name. The house, the car, the bank account, I have nothing." "You have yourself," Miller said. "That's not nothing, and there are people who can help. Lawyers, the church, me, you're not alone in this." "More coffee, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice pitched low. "Please," Miller said, then quieter, "how long they been here?" Dottie returned with the food. The chicken fried steak was enormous, golden brown, smothered in white gravy. The mashed potatoes were piled high. The green beans glistened with butter. The Coke was in a tall glass with ice, condensation already beating on the outside. Caroline stared at the plate like it might vanish if she looked away. "Go on," Miller said. "Eat." She picked up her fork. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She cut a piece of the steak, put it in her mouth, and closed her eyes. A tear ran down her cheek. "It's okay," Miller said quietly. "You're okay." Caroline ate, slowly at first, then faster, as though her body was waking up from a long sleep and remembering what hunger felt like, what satisfaction felt like. She ate the steak and the potatoes and the green beans. She drank the Coke. Dottie brought her a piece of cherry pie, and she ate that too. When she was finished, she set down her fork and looked at Miller with something that might have been the beginning of hope. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Miller said. "This is just the first step. The hard part comes next." "What's the hard part?" "Deciding what you want your life to look like," Miller said, "and then having the courage to make it happen." Caroline was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. "Can we go to that church house now?" "Yes, ma'am." Miller stood up and left money on the table, enough to cover both meals and a generous tip for Dottie. He helped Caroline to her feet. She was unsteady, like someone who hadn't walked in a long time. They walked out to the parking lot together. Miller's car was a 1968 Dodge Polara, dark green with a white roof and a county sheriff's star on the door. He opened the passenger door for her, and she got in. As they drove through the dark streets of the small town, Caroline looked out the window at the houses with their lit windows, at the families inside eating dinner together, watching television, living ordinary lives. "Remember when we went to that steakhouse in Omaha?" Douglas said, forking a massive bite of potato into his mouth. For our anniversary, you ate so much you got sick in the car. That was when I started to worry about you, about your discipline. Why did you help me? She asked. Miller thought about that. He could have given her the easy answer, that it was his job, that he'd sworn an oath to protect people. But that wasn't the whole truth. Had a sister once, he said. Margaret. She married a man who seemed nice enough. Then one day I went to visit and she had bruises on her arms she tried to hide. Said she'd fallen. I knew she hadn't fallen. I told her she should leave and she said she couldn't, said it wasn't that simple. A month later, she was dead. He'd pushed her down the stairs, said it was an accident. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I've spent every day since wishing I'd done more than just tell her to leave. Wishing I'd made her leave. Caroline was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Me too. Miller turned onto a side road, the church steeple visible in the distance. But I can't help her anymore. I can help you. She'd gotten sick because her body had finally rebelled against the accumulation of small violences, the death by 1,000 cuts that was her marriage. She said nothing. Douglas smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he'd won. The church house was a small white building behind the main church, with a porch light burning and a woman waiting on the steps. She was older, maybe 70, with steel-gray hair and a floral housecoat. When the Polera pulled up, she stood and smiled. Miller got out and opened Caroline's door. The older woman came down the steps, moving carefully, and took Caroline's hands in hers. I'm Martha, she said. You're safe here, dear. Come on inside. I've got a room ready and some tea if you'd like it. Caroline looked back at Miller. What if I change my mind? What if I want to go back? Then that's your choice, Miller said. But you don't have to decide tonight, just sleep. See how you feel in the morning. Caroline nodded and let Martha lead her up the steps and into the house. The door closed behind them, and Miller stood in the driveway for a moment, listening to the cicadas and the distant rumble of thunder. On his hip, a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver sat in a leather holster that was older than most of the cars in the parking lot. He walked with the kind of deliberate slowness that made people pay attention, each boot strike on the linoleum a proclamation. He got back in the Polera and drove home through the empty streets of a town that was already asleep. The next morning, Miller was in his office filling out paperwork when the phone rang. It was Martha from the church house. She's still here, Martha said. She wants to talk to that lawyer, and she wants to press charges. Miller felt something unknot in his chest. I'll have the lawyer there by noon. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, Miller said. This is just the beginning. He hung up and stared out the window at Main Street, where the morning sun was already turning the pavement into a griddle. Somewhere out there, Douglas Mercer was probably sitting in his office in Des Moines, telling himself a story about how his wife would come back, how this was just a phase, how he'd get her under control again. But Miller knew better. He'd seen that look in Caroline's eyes last night, not at the beginning, but at the end, after she'd eaten and been heard and been told she mattered. It was the look of someone remembering they were human. And once you remembered that, once you tasted freedom, it was damn hard to go back to the cage. Miller picked up the phone and started making calls. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in October, Miller stopped by the diner for his usual meatloaf. Dottie was behind the counter, and she grinned when she saw him. You here? She said. Hear what? Caroline Mercer. Well, she's Caroline Hendricks again now. Divorce came through last week. She's working at the pharmacy in town. Got herself a little apartment over on Elm Street. Miller smiled. That's good. More than good, Dottie said. She came in here last week and ordered herself the biggest steak on the menu. Ate the whole thing, too, said it was to celebrate. Miller thought about that, about a woman ordering her own steak, eating it without fear, without shame, without someone watching to tell her she didn't deserve it. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase 12 years of cruelty, but it was something. It was a start. Give me the usual, he said to Dottie, and bring me a piece of that cherry pie after. You got it, Sheriff. Miller sat in his booth and looked out the window at Route 9, at the cars passing by on their way to somewhere else, at the neon sign flickering in the daylight. The world was full of men like Douglas Mercer, men who used their power to hurt, who confused control with love, who left scars that nobody could see. But the world was also full of diners like this one. Places where someone might notice, where someone might care, where a sheriff with bad knees and too many cigarettes might decide that today, right now, was the day to do something about it. And sometimes that was enough. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, physical, emotional, or otherwise, please know that help is available. You are not alone, you are not powerless, and you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. In the 1970s, resources were scarce. Today, they are not. Reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, speak to a trusted friend, a pastor, a counselor, or law enforcement. No one has the right to make you feel small. No one has the right to control what you eat, where you go, or who you are. This story is fiction, but the pain it describes is real. If you're in that pain right now, if you're hungry, if you're scared, if you've been told you're nothing without someone who hurts you, please remember Caroline. Remember that she ate that steak. Remember that she left. You can too, and there are people, good people, who will help you do it. God bless and stay strong.